Shalom everybody, and greetings VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. Now, Israelis got some cold comfort this week as the remains of 3 hostages were recovered and brought back to Israel for a dignified burial, leaving just 55 of those who were abducted on October 7, 2023 still in captivity. We got much more comforting news on the northern front as the Defense Ministry now estimates that Hezbollah has lost as much as 85% of its strike capacity, while there are growing signs of quiet cooperation with the new regime in Syria. Israel's relations with Europe also saw some ups and downs this week, including a strategically important delivery of missile defense to Germany and a rather quiet end to the much-hyped Gaza Freedom Flotilla. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. We'll start this week's report by taking a look at the latest events in the Gaza Strip, where Operation Gideon's Chariots is proceeding despite intense opposition not from Hamas, but from the international media and the UN. A key part of the operation is allowing the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a US-based private logistics company, to provide humanitarian aid directly to the people. This is meant to replace the previous system of just sending in trucks for Hamas to steal. This system was working great for Hamas before, so much so that Israeli analysts believed it was one of the most important factors allowing them to continue fighting this war, and they're desperate to prevent it from being taken away from them. But the work of the GHF is doing exactly that, taking away Hamas's ability to control the flow of humanitarian aid to Gazan residents, and they're furious about it. Yay. They've done everything they can to try and prevent Gazan residents from coming to the GHF-run food distribution centers, including sending provocateurs into the centers to try and provoke riots and confrontations with both IDF troops who are guarding the perimeter of these centers, as well as the GHF personnel. There have even been cases of Hamas gunmen opening fire on Gazans who were moving towards the centers to try and get something to eat. The IDF has released drone footage of this for the whole world to see. But that has not stopped large parts of international media from repeating the Hamas narrative, their lies, that the IDF is luring Gazans to these centers just so they can open fire on them. This is not only fake news, it's also observably untrue. It is also absurdly counterintuitive. One side has an obvious interest in civilian casualties, while the other side has an equally obvious interest in preventing civilian casualties. Now, the media knows this, and they know Hamas is trying to scare people away from these distribution centers, and they even know why Hamas wants to do this. But they repeat the Hamas lies and false narratives and fake news anyway. To be fair, the media is also repeating the lies the UN is telling about what's going on in Gaza, despite documented instances of the UN having been infiltrated by Hamas and its general long-running bias against Israel. It is also important in this context to mention that recently uncovered evidence points to collusion between Hamas and Qatar, which is supposed to be mediating negotiations between Hamas and Israel. That's not such a huge surprise, but it does help explain why the negotiations haven't produced any positive results. With all that having been said, I've lived in this country for almost 50 years. Am I that old now? And I've seen the media spin, distort, and outright make things up in an effort to make Israel look bad, but I've never seen anything like this. It is as outrageous and it is evil, but I'm afraid it's just a small taste of what's to come as we draw closer and closer to the end of this age. And the second advent of Yeshua, O Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. As my mentor Derek Prince once said, and reminded us, the enemy's only real weapon is lies and deception, and so he uses those weapons endlessly to try and disrupt God's plan and purposes for this world, especially Israel. Now, getting back to the story, the GHF said this week that despite all the problems they've had, and despite Hamas's best efforts, they are succeeding in distributing aid to the people of Gaza, and so this part of the plan is working. Another part of the plan for Operation Gideon's Chariots is finally returning the hostages, and in the last week, 3 have indeed been returned, although sadly, it was just their remains as they had been murdered in captivity. The first two sets of remains recovered belonged to Judy Weinstein Haggai and Gadi Haggai, who were both dual U.S.-Israeli citizens who were living on the Gaza border community of Kibbutz Nir Oz when it was attacked on October 7, 2023. Last Friday, in a special operation that was part of the larger Gideon's Chariots campaign, their remains were recovered and brought back to Israel so they could receive a dignified burial. That's cold consolation for their families and for the larger nation of Israel, but at least there is some closure to that story. 2 days later, the remains of another hostage, Thai national Natapong Pinta, were recovered. Now, Natapong was a husband and a father, people, and he came to Israel to work in the agricultural sector for a few years so he could earn some decent money that he planned to take back to Thailand and open a small family business. This is a modest dream shared by many others, but for Hamas, it was too much to ask. This reminds us that on October 7, 2023, Hamas terrorists stormed into Israel, raping, murdering, and kidnapping everyone they could find, regardless of their nationality. One of the most terrible images from that day was of a Thai worker being forced to lie down on the ground while two armed men picked up a digging tool and chopped him in the face with it, while he was awake and could experience the terrible agony of it. Evil. All the so-called human rights activists who glorify Hamas as being a bunch of freedom fighters standing up against the racist Zionist state of Israel and all that seem to have completely forgotten about this aspect of the October 7th atrocities. The rescue of these remains of Natapong Pinta is a reminder, though, and by the way, there are two other Thai nationals as well as a citizen of Nepal and another person from Tanzania whose remains are still somewhere in Gaza waiting to be brought home. Now, I know this is somewhat a gruesome subject, but there were also some other human remains being recovered in Gaza these last few days, and they belong to some of the most dangerous and evil men in Hamas. They included Mohammed Sinwar, who took over the leadership of Hamas military wing in the Strip upon the death of his older brother Yahya Sinwar late last year. He and several of his senior henchmen were in a complex of bunkers and tunnels dug underneath the European hospital in Khan Yunis in early May when an Israeli airstrike caved in all the entrances to these bunkers. They stayed there until the last few days when a special operation by the IDF specialists entered the area to clear away the sand and rubble from these tunnel entrances and explore the warren of shafts and bunkers. They found the remains, as I said, as well as stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, and communications gear that Sinwar used to run Hamas operations all over the Gaza Strip and much else. Intelligence information gleaned during these sweeps is already being put to use planning the next moves of the IDF. Speaking of which, the IDF has also suffered, sadly, 8 soldiers killed in action and several more wounded in the past week. This brings the total number to 424 IDF soldiers killed in action since the ground offensive into Gaza began in late 2023. Now, this might sound like a fairly small number compared to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers that fell in the wars of the 20th century, but it is very difficult for such a small army in a small country where everyone knows everyone else, and again, thousands have been wounded. It is also a very difficult and painful reminder that although great progress has been made in this war to restore security to our country, there is still much more work to be done and there are still many hardships which must be endured. Many families are struggling with unemployment, mounting costs, and shrinking opportunities. This week, things might be getting much worse for a lot of people as the governing coalition led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in peril. The ultra-Orthodox parties are threatening to bolt the coalition over issues related to the drafting of young men from their communities into the IDF. This is a long, old, complicated, and frankly depressing story, and there's a chance that a last-minute compromise will be found that will prevent the dissolution of this governing coalition, which would trigger new elections. But if there is no compromise and we are forced to go to new elections, the already fraying social safety net that many people are relying upon could get even more frayed. That's why at Vision for Israel, we've been working tirelessly for years, but never more so often than during this war to provide assistance to families and communities in need. There's a lot of people who still need our help, and I'm sure that won't change for a very long time and for the next decade. So please watch this short video about how you can help us as we try to be a blessing here in the land of Israel. I will bless those that bless thee and curse those that curse thee. We all know that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Welcome back. Now I want to move on to Israel's northern arena, where the big news is that Israel's defense ministry estimates that Hezbollah, the big menace that has been holding a sword over our heads for almost 20 years, has lost as much as 85% of the combat power it had when the war began. It is difficult to overstate how much of a big deal this is, but a news item from this past week gives an idea. I'm talking about strikes by IDF aircraft on the Hezbollah-dominated neighborhood of Batya in southern Beirut. The reason for this strike was the Israeli intelligence had discovered a Hezbollah drone factory and bunkers and tunnels underneath this neighborhood. So the IDF sent out notices to the residents, that's nice of them, that Hezbollah had built this factory under their homes. And unfortunately, that meant an airstrike to destroy the factory was necessary. So the residents needed to leave the area for their own safety. Then it was hit hard, and the drone factory was permanently put out of business. Finito, finished. In the not-so-distant past, Hezbollah would have responded to something like that with a massive barrage of rockets and missiles fired into northern Israel. But following this strike, all they did was whine about it to the UN, which can't help Hezbollah much these days and is even in danger of having its own Lebanese franchise, the utterly useless UN Interim Force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, abolished. That's a developing story, so we'll keep an eye on it for you. It would give me great satisfaction to be able to report to you the demise of UNIFIL, which has been doing absolutely nothing positive or useful for 47 years now, and that's more than enough. Finish. Let them leave. Next door, in Syria, the Israeli Air Force was also in action this last week, bombing targets associated with the al-Jolani regime after 2 rockets were fired into the Galilee from Syrian territory. Now, the rockets caused no damage, but Israel's counterattack did plenty. Once again, the al-Jolani regime barely responded, and that makes me wonder if this might not have been an inside job. In other words, did al-Jolani, who has been quietly talking to Israel and has publicly said that we have some common enemies, set this situation up so that Israel could take out some of his own domestic opposition in southern Syria? Well, we'll probably never know, but that's what my guts are telling me about what happened in Syria last week. Al-Jolani has not only been talking to Israel, he's also been actively moving against Iranian smuggling networks, trying to move weapons and ammunition through Syrian territory to Hezbollah and Lebanon. These networks also move narcotics and also other contraband through southern Syria, and Al-Jolani has, for all intents and purposes, signed off on allowing Israel to control this area, so we will do what it lacks the capacity to do in providing law and order there. Now, it's unclear how long this pragmatic arrangement will last, but I'm glad Israel seems to be taking advantage of it while it does. One reason this is good for Israel is that Iran is at its weakest point in a generation, but it's also more dangerous than ever. Over the weekend, the Washington, D.C.-based Institute for Science and International Security think tank published their analysis of a recent IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency report on Iran's nuclear weapons program. It included details about experiments Iran conducted as far back as 2003, meant to perfect the process of fabricating a trigger for a nuclear bomb. This casts serious doubts on Iran's long-standing claim that its nuclear program is only meant for peaceful civilian purposes like producing medication and electricity. I need to take a moment, guys, and just say this. Why don't you all wake up out there already? The EU, the European Union, the United Nations. Listen, guys, you need to wake up quickly, even in Washington, D.C. Now, the IAEA report also said that Iran has massively increased its stockpile of uranium enriched to 60% purity, which also has no place in a civilian nuclear program. Enriching uranium from 60% purity to 90% purity needed for nuclear weapons is a short hop, skip, and a jump and relatively easy technical process. So this is not a small problem. Ongoing negotiations that Iran is obviously using to stall for time and avoid a military strike are being allowed to continue because the Trump administration and the United States simply doesn't want to do what must be done. It has to be done. I wish I had a more charitable assessment of this situation. I wish I still believed that negotiations are all part of some brilliant strategy President Trump has to get what everyone wants without having to fire a single shot. But I just don't believe that anymore. And I haven't. What I am quite certain of is that Israel is prepared to hit Iran militarily even without U.S. support if we have to. If it comes to that, I also have no doubt that it will be very difficult and also very dangerous for Israel and for all the other countries in the region, as well as even Europe. Iran has promised fierce retaliation if they are attacked, and they haven't limited their threats to Israel. They are also threatening to attack Saudi Arabia and the UAE if Israel hits on them, on the assumption that these countries will have some assistance given to Israel in some way or other. Now, if Iran launches missiles at these countries, possibly in coordination with the Houthis in Yemen, who continue to fire around one ballistic missile at us every so often, maybe every 24 hours, every other day, or every week, the price of oil will increase quickly and dramatically. This could have terrible economic consequences for the whole world, which is already dealing with inflation, shortages, and generally fragile economic conditions. But here in Israel, the danger would be more immediate. We'd be under intense ballistic and cruise missile fire from Iran, possibly for an extended period of time. The defense systems, which have kept us safe in previous attacks, would continue to shoot down many of these incoming weapons, but some will inevitably get through. And that is why here at Vision for Israel, we have continued to place bomb safety shelters at bus stops, schools, community centers, offices, health clinics, and other public places all over Israel for the last several years. Every shelter we place is a long-term investment in the safety, security, and emotional well-being of these communities. And in this war, we know that shelters we've placed have saved lives. So please watch this short video about our bomb safety shelter program here at Vision for Israel. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. And Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, friends. Now I want to stay on the topic of defense from ballistic missiles. Now, as I'm sure you all know, there is a war being fought between Russia and Ukraine that has seen both sides hit the other with long-range weapons causing enormous damage. This has led to great alarm in European countries who are belatedly coming to the realization that they are very vulnerable to attacks from long-range missiles and drones. On the other hand, there is also notice being taken in Europe about the tremendous advances that have been made in missile defense. I'm old enough to remember when a U.S. president named Ronald Reagan first proposed what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which involved building a massive system of radars and interceptor missiles that would work together to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. Now, Reagan's political opponents and critics derided this idea, sarcastically calling it Star Wars, in a nickname which actually stuck and soon began to be used by supporters of the idea and occasionally even Reagan himself. Still, there were some more serious critics who said it would be like trying to hit a bullet with another bullet because these ballistic missiles fly at such high speeds. Still, Reagan pushed ahead with the idea, and 40 years later, systems that shoot down incoming missiles have become quite normal. Now, Israel's Arrow 3 ballistic missile system interceptor in particular has proven itself to be one of the most effective systems and worth every penny that was invested in it over the past 30 years. Now, Israel Aerospace Industries is set to deliver batteries of Arrow 3 system to the German military by the end of 2025. The deal is worth around $3.5 billion, and that is probably just the beginning because other European countries also are interested in buying the Arrow 3. It has proven itself to be highly capable in this war, shooting down dozens of incoming ballistic missiles during both Iranian attacks last year and many more Houthi-fired missiles ever since. In fact, I almost think we should thank the Houthis for giving us so many opportunities to show the world how good the Arrow 3 system is. You can't buy publicity this good, and the Europeans are surely paying attention. The Finnish Air Force already has bought the David Sling mid-range air defense system, and there are many more deals being discussed. In fact, this week, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte gave a speech in which he said that alliance members need to increase spending on missile defense by 400% in order to counter the threat from Russia. It's worth mentioning in this context that Israel makes all kinds of things that Europe needs these days, and not just in the area of missile defense and other military equipment. We also make high-tech communications gear, green energy solutions, agricultural and water technology, which is especially relevant these days as Northern Europe is experiencing a terrible drought which has massively decreased agricultural production. Last but not least, Israel produces substantial quantities of natural gas, and Europe needs that to replace the lost supplies from Russia. One would hope that the pragmatic forces in Europe know all about that and will be able to push back against those forces of irrational anger and hatred towards Israel that have arisen in Europe in recent years. Well, that's a nice segue into our last story for this week's report, which will also allow me to continue the tradition of ending with some good news. Here we go. The so-called Freedom for Gaza Flotilla was in reality just a single sailboat named the Madeleine, which set sail from Sicily last week carrying a crew of professional malcontents and their smartphones, which they used to take endless selfies and videos to post on social media. It was just the latest attempt to recreate the anti-Israel buzz, which resulted from the disastrous Mavi Marmara flotilla incident 16 years ago. Like so many others before it, it failed to reach Gaza, which was never its real purpose, but it also failed in provoking a violent confrontation with the IDF, which could be filmed, and the film posted to social media, which was its real purpose. So in the end, with hardly any drama or fanfare, the Shayetet 13, which is like the Marines' naval commandos, came alongside the Madeleine, boarded it, and took the crew into custody, sailing the ship to Ashdod, where the crew was given a basic medical checkup and then given the opportunity, plus lunch, to watch the footage of atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7, 2023. Well, sadly, they only watched a few moments of the film and then refused to watch the rest, which is too bad because they might have learned something for a change. In the early morning hours of Tuesday, they were taken to Ben Gurion Airport so they could leave this country they say they hate so much as quickly as possible. Bye-bye. In the end, the most memorable photograph of the event that was posted to social media showed Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg wearing a silly green hat and smiling at an Israeli naval commando whose back is to the camera as he hands her something to eat. And so this silly, stupid, obnoxious melodrama ended not with a bang, but with a sandwich. Why didn't I get one? Jokes aside, I sincerely hope that their short stay in Israel, which probably provided their first contact with actual Israelis, moves the hearts of some of these activists even a little to be less hateful and more understanding. I know I'm probably wrong to give them that much of the benefit of the doubt, but as Jews say, Tamid yesh tikva, there is always hope. On that note, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another great edition of VFI News from Israel, and we'd appreciate your comments and send me to info@Vision for Israel, whatever you'd like to say. God bless you and shalom. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee.